Today, we're really digging into something major, something that could genuinely reshape the global stage. Those recent U.S. military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. This isn't just another headline. It feels like an unfolding drama, right? With
Yeah.
potentially huge implications for, well, for all of us. So our mission today is to take the sources you've given us. We've got everything from official White House announcements to uh, deep dives from military experts, plus on-the-ground reporting, and really unpack what matters. We want to help you understand the different layers here. It's complex. You've got the military action itself, the precision, but also these huge geopolitical ripples spreading outwards. You'll hear the official line, sure, but also the strategic thinking behind it, and importantly, what it actually feels like for people closer to the action. Okay, so let's start with the strikes themselves. President Trump came out, very clearly announced an attack on 3 specific nuclear sites in Iran: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. And he made a point of saying all planes got back safely. But looking at the sources, what really jumps out isn't just that it happened, but the message it was sending.
That's exactly right. What's really striking when you look at the reporting, say from News Nation, is that this wasn't some, reactive scramble. No, this was planned meticulously. For months, we're talking serious logistics here. Think about it. B-2 stealth bombers flying all the way from Missouri, nonstop. That means multiple mid-air refuelings just to get there. Then dropping payloads on several highly sensitive targets, and this is the kicker, getting out of Iranian airspace without Iran firing a single shot back, apparently. That speaks volumes about the execution.
Wow. Okay. So beyond just hitting targets, there's a message.
Oh, definitely. A powerful implicit message. By hitting some of Iran's most heavily fortified sites and doing it from halfway across the world, the U.S. was basically demonstrating, look, we can touch anywhere in Iran. Distance, fortifications, they don't guarantee safety from U.S. capabilities. It's a very clear signal.
And Fordow was specifically mentioned. Why was that one so significant?
Right, Fordow comes up a lot in the reports, like from DW News. It's described as highly fortified, underground, buried deep, basically considered almost unreachable by normal bombs. And it's where Iran was reportedly enriching uranium up to 60%. Now, that's way beyond civilian needs. Dangerously close to weapons grade.
So hitting that required something special.
Exactly. To get Fordow, the U.S. needed the GBU-57. You might know it as the bunker buster or MOP, massive ordnance penetrator. It's huge. Apparently only the U.S. has it. It can supposedly penetrate up to 200 feet of earth or concrete before exploding.
200 feet? That's incredible.
It is. And President Trump, in his statement, he didn't mince words. He just said Fordow was gone.
Okay, so the strikes were precise. The message seems clear. But what about the immediate aftermath? What was the feeling on the ground, especially in the region? Was it chaos or something else?
Well, it's interesting. Reports from Tel Aviv, via News Nation, described the mood as surprisingly quiet. As quiet as it's ever been, was the quote. People were apparently following guidance from their home front command. Stay inside, stay near shelters.
So a tense quiet, like everyone holding their breath.
Exactly that. A tense calm, this feeling of anticipation, waiting for what might happen next. But here's another layer. Despite this major military action, the sources suggest back channels between the U.S. and Iran actually stayed open.
Really? Even after the bombing?
Yeah. Apparently, there were still hopes for some kind of diplomatic resolution.
Yeah.
It really highlights that difference between, the public statements and the tough talk and the crucial behind-the-scenes communication. That's where the important conversations happen, as one source put it.
That is fascinating. So the strikes weren't necessarily meant to shut down talks, but maybe shake things up, force a different kind of conversation.
That's precisely the analysis coming from military experts like Dan Caldwell. He argues the U.S. perspective was that diplomacy wouldn't work or wouldn't yield results without these strikes.
Oh, I see.
So the military action wasn't the end of diplomacy in their view. It was a tool to try and force a diplomatic opening, a prerequisite almost. It's a very different way of looking at it.
Okay, so the U.S. strikes, hoping to force talks. What about Iran's reaction? Did they immediately confirm it, retaliate?
Well, at the time the sources were reporting, Iran hadn't officially confirmed the strikes, and no immediate retaliation. But Dan Caldwell gives a pretty strong warning here. He says, don't assume Iran won't respond just because it wasn't immediate.
Right. History suggests otherwise.
Absolutely. He points to the Soleimani strike. Remember that. Iran eventually responded, but they sort of telegraphed it, which gave U.S. troops time to take cover. And even more recently, after some Israeli actions, Iran launched a massive barrage, something like 400 to 500 ballistic missiles. Now, reports say they weren't as effective as maybe Iran hoped, but they still caused casualties. People were killed, hundreds wounded in Israel. So the expectation is definitely that some kind of response is likely coming.
That's sobering. So if Iran does respond, what are the potential consequences, especially for U.S. troops in the region? And it brings up that bigger question. Can just one or two strikes really settle this? Or is this just the first step onto a dangerous ladder?
Yeah, Dan Caldwell is pretty clear on this. He fundamentally believes one or two strikes won't be enough. He actually warns people should expect a longer and much more bloody military campaign.
Longer and bloodier.
Yes. And he lays out this potential escalation ladder. It's quite chilling, actually. Step 1. If U.S. troops get attacked, the U.S. hits back, likely harder and with larger strikes. Then you could see Iran targeting regional bases, places in Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, if they think the U.S. is using them for attacks. And Caldwell adds a wrinkle here. He notes these Gulf states might not be as automatically cooperative as they perhaps were back in, say, 2019. Their agreement isn't a given.
Okay, that complicates things further. What else is on this ladder?
Worst-case scenarios include attacks on U.S. ships in the Arabian Sea or the Persian Gulf, even attacks on U.S. diplomatic facilities like embassies. It's a grim picture of potential escalation.
And what about the U.S. troops already there? You mentioned them being attacked as a trigger.
Right, and this leads to a really critical point Caldwell makes about U.S. troops acting as tripwires.
Mm-hmm.
He points out there are still thousands of U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Syria, right? Even though the major wars are supposedly over. He basically calls them easy targets for militias aligned with Iran. And get this, he highlights the absurdity that the U.S. is actively training the Iraqi army, which is part of the same government that includes militias loyal to Iran.
Wait, really?
Yeah, he calls it the most convoluted mission on the face of the earth. Our troops are in this incredibly awkward, dangerous position.
That idea of troops as tripwires, it sounds almost intentional. Does Caldwell suggest why they're kept in such vulnerable spots? Is it just inertia?
He leans heavily on policy inertia. You know, it's just easier to keep doing what you're doing, maintain the status quo, than it is to make a big change and pull back. But he also implies that maybe some policymakers, perhaps not even consciously, have allowed troops to be put in these positions because they act as a tripwire. It creates a situation where a small incident can trigger a much larger conflict. It's a really provocative thought about how foreign policy sometimes works or doesn't work.
And what's the impact on the troops themselves? All this tension, the constant deployments.
Caldwell paints a pretty stark picture. He talks about senior NCOs, officers, people with 15, 20, 25 years in. They're tired, just worn out.
I can only imagine.
Multiple deployments, sometimes 7 or 8 tours. And life, say, on a ship in that region, he describes it as very isolating, scary, a feeling of having no control. And he mentions there have been very, very close calls recently, like an F-18 fighter jet actually falling off the deck of the USS Harry S. Truman because the ship had to maneuver so aggressively to dodge a Houthi anti-ship missile.
Wow, that's harrowing.
It is. And he argues another war would just stretch the military even thinner. It pulls resources away from fixing internal problems, things like dilapidated barracks, addressing culture issues. There are real costs beyond the immediate fight.
That's a really bleak assessment of where things stand for the military, which brings us back to the core reason given for the strikes, Iran's nuclear program. What does all this mean for actually stopping Iran from getting a bomb? Can airstrikes, even precise ones, actually achieve that goal?
Well, Dan Caldwell's answer on this is pretty definitive. No. An air campaign alone cannot end a nuclear program.
Cannot. Not just it's difficult, but cannot.
Cannot, according to him. He says strikes can absolutely roll it back. They can severely damage it, sure.
Yeah.
But truly shutting it down for good, that requires verification on the ground. Think about it. You need inspectors in there confirming that all the centrifuges are gone, all the nuclear materials accounted for, the triggers, the delivery systems. You even need to know what happened to the scientists and engineers involved. And that, he says, is simply impossible to do purely through air. You just can't be sure without boots on the ground, essentially.
So what would it take, in his view?
To really dismantle the program, make absolutely sure it's totally dismantled, he suggests it would, and I quote, likely going to require a regime change or some type of occupation or invasion.
Regime change or invasion, that's a massive escalation from airstrike.
It is. It's a stark assessment, moving far beyond just precision bombing.
So, despite all the advanced tech, the bunker busters, air power has its limits when it comes to nukes. Does he think policymakers in D.C. get that?
He seems pretty skeptical. What's really striking is his observation, and it's a blunt one, that many in Washington, D.C. have learned nothing from Iraq, from Syria, from Libya,
Yeah.
from Afghanistan, from Yemen.
Oof.
Yeah. He finds it concerning that there's still this belief in some circles that you can, quote, instill liberalism through the point of the barrel of a gun, despite all the evidence from the last 20 plus years.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Beyond Iran and the U.S., how does this play out on the bigger geopolitical chessboard? What about players like Russia and China? They have their own relationships with Iran.
Right. Caldwell talks about the immediate regional dynamic almost like a race between Iran and Israel. He describes both sides trying to destroy the other's missile launchers while protecting their own, and at the same time, try and make the other side use up its valuable interceptors and precision weapons.
Yeah.
He says there's huge time pressure on both.
A missile race, essentially.
Pretty much. Now, Russia, despite its ties to Iran, like being in BRICS together, Caldwell thinks it's unlikely they'll get heavily involved militarily. Why? Because Russia's own military and industrial base is just stretched so thin by the war in Ukraine, it would be very difficult for them to divert weapons or significant resources elsewhere right now.
Okay, so Russia's likely preoccupied. What about China?
China's calculation is different, more subtle maybe. They're probably not going to jump in with the direct military support for Iran either, but China definitely stands to benefit if the U.S. gets bogged down in another Middle East conflict.
How so?
Because the kinds of things the U.S. would use heavily against Iran, advanced air defense systems, standoff missiles, air-to-surface munitions, those are the exact same things the U.S. needs for any potential conflict in the Pacific. Think Taiwan, Japan, South Korea.
So it drains resources needed elsewhere.
Exactly. China can practice what Caldwell calls smart power. Maybe they provide some non-lethal stuff to Iran, things that help Iran resist or prolong things, basically wearing down U.S. resources and focus without China getting its hands dirty directly.
So China plays the long game, attrition. But is there a risk that non-lethal support crosses a line, or is it purely about tying us down?
Caldwell frames it mainly as resource attrition and distraction. The immediate effect is indirect, just making any conflict longer, costlier for the U.S., tying up those critical assets. But he also makes this broader, really interesting point. He argues that decades of U.S. foreign policy have kind of unintentionally pushed countries like Russia, Iran, and China closer together.
Even though they have historical tensions?
Right. Despite natural rivalries, U.S. actions have created these opportunities for cooperation between them that might not have otherwise existed. It makes the whole global picture much more complicated.
This really does bring us to the bigger question about American power itself. I mean, getting involved in another potential major conflict in the Middle East, what does that actually mean for U.S. resources, for its military, its global strategy?
Caldwell uses the phrase contracting American empire. He suggests the U.S. doesn't really have the will or the money to sustain it at current levels, and this potential conflict really throws that into sharp relief.
How does it show up immediately?
Ukraine is the clearest example. The sources say the U.S. already had to divert artillery shells meant for Ukraine to Israel. If a wider war with Iran kicks off, critical things like Patriot missile defense systems would almost certainly be pulled from Ukraine to protect U.S. forces in the Middle East.
So we literally can't do both.
He argues the U.S. is undersupplied and cannot easily do both. Not effectively, anyway. Supporting two major conflicts like that simultaneously puts an immense strain on existing stockpiles and production. And he criticizes the U.S. defense industry here, too. Says it's too focused on building really expensive systems with lots of bells and whistles, but in smaller numbers. Instead of mass-producing maybe cheaper and in some cases less advanced weapons that you actually need in large quantities for a long fight. He gives this stark example. The U.S. has only made about 900 to 1,000 THAAD interceptors. Those are the high-end missile defense rockets. Iran, meanwhile, is estimated to have 2,000 to 3,000 ballistic missiles that can reach Israel. The math just doesn't look good in a sustained missile exchange.
That's a worrying imbalance. But does he think the U.S. can still influence things? Or are we just stretched too thin?
Oh, he definitely thinks the U.S. still has the power.
Yeah.
He says the U.S. perfectly has the capability to shape outcomes, to use its leverage with countries in the Middle East. He even points to historical examples like Reagan's administration dealing with Israel. So the capability for influence is there. It's more a question of strategy, resource allocation, and maybe political will.
And Caldwell really pushes back on the idea that focusing so much on Iran serves core U.S. interests, right?
Yeah.
He mentioned liberal hegemony. Are there other ways the sources frame why Iran is such a focus?
He specifically argues it's not primarily about core national interest because, in his view, Iran simply isn't an existential threat to the United States itself, not in the way that maybe China or Russia are considered peer competitors. So why the focus? He suggests it's driven at least in part by this belief among some policymakers in liberal hegemony, this idea that the U.S. needs to be the world's dominant power, and part of that means needing to impose our values on other parts of the world. He sees that ideology as a key driver, perhaps more than a cold calculation of threat.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We dove into the specifics of the U.S. strikes on Iran, the meticulous planning, the message sent. We looked at the tense quiet afterwards, the back-channel diplomacy still happening, but also the very real risk of escalation. We heard about U.S. troops potentially acting as tripwires, the debate over whether air power alone can ever stop a nuclear program, and how this all plays out with Russia and China watching closely. And finally, the strain this puts on U.S. resources and the questions it raises about American power. It's incredibly complex, with huge stakes, and it really forces us, doesn't it, to ask some tough questions. What are the true costs of intervention like this? Can military power really achieve these big political goals? And what about all the unintended consequences down the road? As the U.S. tries to figure out its role in this rapidly changing world, you have to consider the human cost, the strain on the military and resources. What does a win even look like in a situation like this? And maybe more importantly, who gets to decide? That's something to really chew on long after the news cycle moves on.